Is there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Hi, I'm Matthew.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome back to the TEFLology podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters, presented by 3 self-certified TEFLologists.
TEFL News. Today's TEFL News is another book review. First of all, before we start, I want to ask you guys, to what extent do you think your maleness or your masculinity has had any kind of effect on your career as a language teacher?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I mean, go ahead.
I mean, like, nothing explicitly. Like, I've never felt like it was important when I've been for job interviews and things like that. I think certainly, like, in the classroom, I think
Right.
maybe you use your position as a man and it kind of informs the way you teach, maybe.
Can you give an example?
I don't know, but maybe this is stereotypical, just the whole position of a teacher standing in front of the class, kind of telling jokes, maybe. I don't know.
It sounds stereotypical.
Yeah. I think part of the problem, though,
I'm not sure.
Is that, I mean, somebody's gender is such an integral part of their identity. That it would be hard, I think, to separate that from, the rest of your identity.
Right.
I think what I'm trying to say is that nothing explicit.
Okay.
Right.
That's what I'm trying to say.
And also, we don't know. We don't have the experience of being a woman in this industry.
Right.
So it's hard to filter out the things that maybe are genders or have had an influence because of our gender.
Yeah.
I guess maybe the only thing I can think of is occasionally being in a position of like management or overseeing other people, and maybe in that case being aware when I interact with people, and especially the position where I am now, where there's 4 of us managers and we're all male.
Right.
And I think if there were different gender mix there, it might have different dynamics.
Right.
I feel one more thing. I feel that, like, as a male, I have to be mindful of the way I interact with, like, female students, and I'm always mindful of how other instructors perceive interaction of that nature.
Right.
Okay.
That's interesting. Well, today, for the news section, I'm going to talk about a new book by Roslyn Appleby called Men and Masculinities in Global English Language Teaching, which I've just finished reading. And the title is in Global English Language Teaching. It's actually in Japanese English Language Teaching. It's another one of those cases where the title is, I think, designed for as many people as possible to be attracted to it. And in the book, what she does is she interviews men at who've all been teaching in Japan for a fairly long time about their careers in Japan, and analyses them in terms of how they construct their sense of masculinity in the industry, particularly in, as she says, in a very male-dominated industry. So all of the men started working in Eikaiwa schools, English conversation schools, or in high schools as assistant language teachers, and most of them now work in, like, universities. What kind of things do you imagine those men said about how they constructed their masculinities at different stages of their careers?
Could you explain construct their masculinity?
Okay, so for example, one of the things that she draws on, one of the sources she draws on, kind of to explain what she's talking about, is the idea of the charisma man. Have you heard of the charisma man?
Perhaps you should explain.
So this was a comic strip which appeared in a magazine called The Alien in Japan. It's about a white Western guy who comes to Japan. He's kind of scrawny and working in a Burger King or something back in America. And he comes to Japan, and kind of like Superman or Banana Man, he's transformed into this masculine hunk whenever he's in the presence of Japanese women. And whenever he sees his arch rival Western woman, she's kind of like his kryptonite. He shrinks back into the emasculated white guy.
Right.
So that's one example of how someone constructed their masculinity through while living abroad in a different context.
That's not particularly related to English teaching. Just the whole exotic orient otherness.
Right. But isn't that connected?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And I guess part of the problem with the charisma man thing is it wasn't really about him. It was about how how the cartoonist thought the Japanese people were perceiving this guy.
But it's also about how the guy himself perceives himself when he's in the company of those people. How he perceives himself
only
as
reacting
being hyper-masculine, hypersexual, that kind of thing.
Right, but that doesn't come out of nothing. That comes out of the way they treat him.
Yeah.
Like he couldn't construct that identity in front of Western women, according to this the cartoonist.
Right. Yeah, that's.
I mean, it seemed like he was saying more about Japanese culture than the Western people here.
Oh, really? I think it was. I thought kind of the opposite. I was saying more about the West. But anyway,
I think that's what he intended. But I think what it actually was doing was showing what he thought that the way he thought Japanese people were perceiving Western.
Right. So it kind of subconsciously revealed something about the way that people perceived Japanese culture.
Yeah.
As opposed. Okay. Right. That makes sense.
So you talked about constructing.
Yeah.
How did they collect this research? Was it like?
Well, so it was done
through
with
interviews.
Yes, it was done over interviews with people at different stages of their careers. So there are a few different stages to this. There are a few different kinds of masculinities that she says these men construct. So first of all, you've got this idea of the kind of as I said, the hypersexual white guy in Japan, who, like, none of her interviewees actually admitted, I came to Japan in order to pick up chicks.
Right.
But they all had stories of other men who did it, other men who got into teaching because this was, they were trying to do that. But they always said, so I know these people, but I wasn't one of those guys.
Yeah.
So they construct their own masculinity as a professional. Kind of in contrast to these other guys.
Okay.
So there's a kind of a professional masculinity there. And they do the same thing as university professors. They say they build this. She calls it. Appleby calls it a rationalized masculinity. So it's like these men not being driven by their sexual desires or by their maleness, but by being professional, detached, living very rational lives of the mind, that kind of thing. It's apparently that's a different kind of masculinity that they're constructing.
Right.
Yeah. Does that ring true to you at all? Any of your?
I've been in positions where people have put. Well, this always happens. People put you on the spot. Why did you come to Japan? And you kind of. I've kind of have a repertoire, a stock story that I always use now, but that's been constructed over time, and I don't think it's entirely true. Like my own story, which there's no point going into, but I think I've rationalised it myself and kind of created like a legitimate position for myself, which may or may not be true.
Right.
And does it have any connection to your gender? Without getting into too much detail.
I don't know. Well, that's the thing. I talked about, in terms of the job I'm currently doing, I don't think it has any explicit impact. But when you think about the reason I actually came or left the UK or came to Japan, then maybe it does have something to do with that. I don't know.
I think this is one of the very interesting things about the book. Is it makes you think, well, is that what I'm doing?
Yeah.
Am I constructing my own identity in the same way? And especially as people working in universities, you can kind of see some of the things that those people say, the fact that they reject all these negative stereotypes, and they construct themselves in opposition to those stereotypes of white male teachers in Japan.
Do you not also think there's a question of like native speakerism?
Yes, yeah.
As well, not just a masculine thing. It also applies to women as well.
Well, yeah, to an extent.
Right.
I think that there's an interrelation between the different points of native speaker and male and white and all these kinds of things.
Yeah, you can plot
they're
that
intersectional in a sense.
Like what's interesting to me is I worked as an assistant language teacher, which means you go into public junior high schools or high schools and you're assistant to the main English teacher, so-called main English teacher, who's usually Japanese, and I think like all ALTs, you have the experience of, you get little notes and stuff from students, and almost always female students, and it's got, hearts on it, and it's got like, cute little messages. But then you quickly realize, you talk to, female ALT friends, and they get the same notes.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the thing. A lot of the guys in these interviews in Appleby's book, they talk about like, oh yeah, I go into the classroom and there are some students, like some female students, who make goo eyes at me and that kind of thing, and I think, Jesus, girl, I'm 49 years old. I could be your father. And I did kind of think, reading that, I bet they're not doing that to you. That's you reading into their behaviour what you want to see there.
I was having a conversation with like someone recently, and they were saying that they think the whole paternal aspect of being a teacher, like the way that you kind of take on a parent's kind of role or a father role for some of these students, he was kind of saying that kind of, you could kind of trace like a kind of a sexual undercurrent to all of that. Do you think that's true?
Well, I think it depends on the person. It depends on your relationship with your students, I guess. This thing is, it's very complicated. Actually, one of my criticisms of this book is that it almost seems like no matter what the men said, she could tie it in some way to this development of to them constructing their masculinity. So if they're talking about themselves as like sexualizing students and dating students, then that's part of how they construct their masculinity. If they're being professional and being against that, then that's them constructing their masculinity. So it kind of seems like it's unfalsifiable in a sense, like anything could be them constructing their masculinity, or you can make it fit into the pattern somewhere. So I did wonder about that a little bit. Another issue, something that's been talked about a lot online recently, is the idea of this, female-dominated profession, but with at the top of the totem pole, especially in Japan, in the universities, which are seen as, rightly or wrongly, as the kind of top jobs, most of the teachers are male. And why is that? And Appleby discusses the homosocial networks of men. So men go out drinking together. Men have all these different parties. Men give each other jobs and give put words forward for each other and that kind of thing. So men eventually filter to the top. And then in the universities, there's a lot of Japanese men who are also in the system. But she said when she asked these guys, why do women not stay in Japan, or why don't women get into these top jobs? They all said, it's because they can't find a boyfriend, basically. So I was...
Are there any numbers in the book on the ratio of how many male to female Westerners come to Japan just in the first place to teach English?
Actually, I don't think there are about that. There are ratios of how many there are who stay certain numbers of years. How many work in different jobs, but I don't know in total if there's a particular number.
Diane Hawley Nagatomo, one of our former interviewees, talked about in a presentation we went to. She talked about the story of these two characters, a male and a female. And she kind of said, and obviously the woman, she struggles, she can't find a boyfriend easily, she goes home. So it's exactly the same as what you said.
Right, but is that the reason? Is it that she just can't find a boyfriend, or is it because there are these homosocial networks that support men's career development but not women's career development?
Yeah, I don't think it comes down to something as crude as she couldn't find a boyfriend.
Right.
Because that's not a reason for coming anywhere in the first place, is it? Or is it a reason?
Well, but it could well be. I mean, that's kind of what... Actually, one of the interviewees in the book does say, only one of them admits, I came to Japan for, partly because I'd heard the stories of, Japanese women really wanting to, have Western partners.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good book. I think it's really interesting. It made me as a man working in Japan as a language teacher. It made me reflect on maybe some of the things that I've said, some of the ways that I construct my professional identity and think about myself as a man. And also, I think the idea of the homosocial networks is really interesting because I think that may lie at the heart of why there is this gender imbalance in, ELT, and on this podcast, as we've been recently reminded of a couple of times.
Sure.
But
does that not extend to other industries?
Oh, of course.
Right.
But not all other industries are female-dominated, and ELT is.
You mean outside of... or female-dominated?
In lots of industries, Well, in ELT, the majority of people working in ELT are female.
Right. Okay.
But the majority of people in the top jobs are male, and the majority of like plenary speakers and stuff are male.
Okay.
In other fields, there's the same thing, but it's perhaps more surprising in ELT because it is a female-dominated industry in terms of the overall numbers.
In places like,
But not in Japan.
Not in Japan, no.
in places like Canada, apparently almost 80% of attendees and presenters are female.
Right.
I'm not sure about presenters particularly. But
Yeah.
definitely attendees.
When I worked in Europe, in language schools in Europe, it was mostly female teachers.
Right.
And I was surprised when I came here and it was the opposite.
Yeah. So I think I'd recommend reading the book. I'd recommend especially reading it if you're a man working in Japan in Japanese higher education, because it'll give you a good perspective. I think there is an issue with this idea that kind of anything could be interpreted as being part of constructing masculinities, but I think there's enough stuff in there to justify her viewpoints. And I also think that the other ideas about the homosocial networks and stuff is well worth thinking about. Yeah.
I mean, anything that gets you questioning how you construct your own identity, I think is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the new book from Roslyn Appleby, Men and Masculinities in Global English Language Teaching. It's published by Palgrave Macmillan, and I give it 3 stars out of other numbers of stars.
Are we giving ratings? Okay.
No, I give it 3.5 out of 4. That's what I'd say.
Wow,
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
You're perfect.
Yes, yeah. So that's today's TEFL news. TEFL cultures.
Okay, so for this week's TEFL culture, I'd like to talk about crazy English. Are you familiar with this?
No.
I've heard a little bit, but I don't know very much.
Well, this was something that I came across very recently. I went to a presentation just last weekend. It won't be last weekend when this goes out, but
Yeah, we should stop making time references.
it was last weekend. And the presenter talked about crazy English, and I didn't know what it meant. And a lot of other people in the crowd didn't know what it was either.
Right.
So I'm going to talk about this, what it is, basically,
Okay.
crazy English.
Sure.
In Japan, we have yakudoku, which is a very Japan-specific way of learning English or studying or using English.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of other country-specific types as well. I think like very recently, Matt, you talked about speed learning or accelerated learning. This is kind of another buzz approach to teaching.
Yeah.
So this is another way. This is a China-based approach.
Okay.
Called Crazy English. It's a brand name, and it was conceived by a guy called Li Yang.
Okay.
And the premise of this approach is you just yell in English, you shout stuff in English.
I've heard of this.
Yeah.
You get together.
Why?
You get together. Maybe you have a whole company of people, like a whole company or a whole school of people. You gather in stadiums and you just shout English.
Yeah.
Is it like listen and repeat? Or?
Yeah, kind of call and respond. He says, and then they repeat. And I think it's specific to what they're learning, what they need it for.
Right.
Stadium rock English teaching.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's it basically. It's just. I mean, he even says himself, by shouting out loud, you learn.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does he base that on anything?
No.
Oh.
He's this guy himself. He's an entrepreneur.
Okay.
He's made millions from this approach. I think it's tailed off now.
Right.
But it was very much part of the English fever of China. That's kind of in the post-Olympic era. That's kind of tailed off.
Yeah.
But it was from the 70s onwards. It was very.
Could you
much
see
on.
this as a reaction to the silent way?
It's the complete opposite, complete antithesis. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
What I like about this is that it brings up this issue of the idea of listen and repeat, which is very popular in classrooms. Even I mean, still now in so-called communicative language.
Yeah, do drilling and stuff.
Drilling, like repeat after me. And you ask teachers about it, and they say, it doesn't hurt, it doesn't take much time. And I think, and then they get to the point. But I think really, the students just saying the words, it's good for them.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. It's based on nothing. It's based on this. Yeah. I mean, it kind of makes sense. Oh yeah, if you shout the words over and over again, it'll somehow stick in your head.
Yeah.
But it's based on nothing.
On one of my CELTA lessons, I remember I had like this list of phrases, and it was one of the very early ones, and I got all the students to stand up, and then I drilled them in these like really overly long phrases that were too long for them, and it lasted a really long time, and after about 5 minutes, one of the students went, "Oh my god!" a pass though,
Right.
because the cells got no sound.
So as I say, I think it's tailed off now, but at its peak, they were selling millions of. He sold millions of books and tapes with this approach.
How do you sell a book?
He's appeared on.
All caps.
He's appeared on documentaries. I think his books contain just like items to shout, basically, and they are just itemized.
So like a
He's
phrase
taking
book
shouts.
in capital letters, basically.
But there were also stories of like people, like school kids, going behind sheds or going behind.
There's always
just going
stories
off,
of school kids
just
going
going to
behind
parks with their friends and just shouting stuff,
Yeah.
basically,
Right.
based on his approach, basically.
You could
And-
probably make millions, like, whisper approach, whisper
Yeah.
English. Just
Well,
like
the
the
silent way.
same book, but like in small italics or something. Just whisper this to yourself. That makes more sense,
The
actually.
aside approach.
Yeah.
Like self-talk, or,
Yeah, whispering things to your friends surreptitiously approach.
Yeah,
get a
so,
load of this guy.
so Lee himself is. So as I said, I think this approach has kind of tailed off now, but nobody has actually tested this approach or
Okay.
added any
Done any
kind of
research.
theoretical underpinning to it. But there has been a few commentators on it that
Okay.
kind of. I mean, this article that I have here, English as a Chinese language, kind of criticizes it somewhat, or uses it as an example of the ELT industry in China.
Right.
But is quite critical of it, not in this actual section,
Okay.
but is critical of it overall. And yeah, he's been kind of Li Yang himself has kind of been unfairly portrayed in like interviews and TV documentaries about this approach. So I think the popularity has kind of tailed off this approach.
Why'd you say unfairly portrayed?
That's what he said of himself.
He
I think
he's been unfairly
I
portrayed.
think because so many people got behind this approach and bought into it, and he got very rich out of it. I think documentary makers were like, "Hang on, what's really going on here?"
Yeah.
And they've kind of seen through it and seen that it's a bit stupid. And
Well, sounds like he's being fairly portrayed.
well, he claims unfairly.
Right.
Yeah. So what do you think of this kind of fad or buzz, or any others of this like nature? Like,
I think it's inevitable. People come up with an idea. It's something that sounds, to people who don't know anything about it, it sounds superficially plausible, right? If you shout things out loud, and also there's a certain energy, there's like an attractive energy to that,
Yeah.
that you can shout and scream and
I mean,
and
you probably
learn.
feel great at the end of a lesson.
Yeah. Well, it releases endorphins, suddenly shouting and screaming. I can see why people. And I imagine if you're in a stadium with people who are all screaming, then you work yourself up into a frenzy, and so I can see why it would become popular, but it probably doesn't work.
I mean, I don't know much about the Chinese kind of English learning setting, but I imagine that things are done in this big group way there. So this doesn't seem too out of character for what you'd expect of China.
Right.
Yeah.
In
Are
that,
you
in
saying
that way. No, I mean you have larger. Think about like the number of students they have to teach.
Right,
You know,
right.
this has a purpose, So it's not completely crazy. I don't
Right.
think,
So it is completely crazy. It's called Crazy
That's the
English.
brand name. Yeah.
I mean, what's interesting about it is it's kind of an extreme example of these methods based on nothing, basically, but have some kind of like you see a lot of the speed learning, for example, the things where you just listen to, a cassette or a CD, cassette, over and over again. You just hear somebody reading the phrases, and people, those things sell by the bucket loads.
Yeah.
It's like putting the radio under your pillow, and that's how you learn.
So recently people have been going on about shadowing, which it just sounds like the same thing to me. It's like a buzzword, shadowing.
Right.
And apparently that's like this new thing that a lot of the professors in my department are getting really excited about. But
there is a communicative shadowing.
Right. But the ones the ones that I've seen in the shops are just books where you play a CD and repeat. It's just listen and repeat.
I remember when I was learning French, I was told just watch French TV and just say what the people on TV were saying. It's good for pronunciation. That's it. Maybe.
It's also been claimed in a New Yorker article that it has perhaps capitalist values. So one of his quotes was "Conquer English to make China stronger." So it seems like he's kind of using this as a way to claim English for China's own needs, perhaps.
Right.
And these kind of rallying marches of just shouting English sentences.
Do you think that's how? Do you think that's his sense of nationalism coming through, or do you think that it's it's appealing to a sense of nationalism as a part of the advertising.
It comes from his philosophy, according to this article.
Okay.
That he's documented himself.
Right, but do you agree with that? Do you think he's telling the truth?
No, but I mean, there have been a number of articles written about the way that English is used in China, as it is in Japan as well, for different means. You know, I think English plays a local part. You know, in any country, it has some kind of importance. That's different from another country, for example. Anyway, yeah. So that's crazy English.
TEFL pioneers.
So the TEFL pioneer for this episode is Jean Manesca.
Okay.
You heard of Jean Manesca?
No.
It's a Frenchman.
Obviously.
Well, yeah, I guess. His dates are 1778, question mark,
Okay.
to 1838.
Right.
No question mark.
Okay.
Definitely died then.
Yeah, so just to say at the beginning, there's not a lot of information about him, biographical information about him. But every reference to him kind of credits him as one of the fathers of modern language teaching. Basically.
Okay.
Mainly through a book he wrote called An Oral System of Teaching Living Languages, illustrated by a practical course of lessons in the French through the medium of the English.
In the French.
In the French through the medium of the English.
Okay.
Is the title.
All right. Is that directly translated from like Le Français or whatever?
I guess so. I guess so. But that's what I did find online was a PDF of the cover page of the book.
Okay.
And that's what it says.
Oh, nice.
So he wrote this book. So he was a French teacher, and I think he spent some time in the States.
Right.
In fact, he did. He taught French in the States. He was a language teacher in France, and he moved to the States. And I guess he is credited. He was an influence on Ollendorff, Heinrich Ollendorff.
Okay. Yeah.
Who was like just before Guan and some of the other pioneers that we talked about.
Yeah.
We should do him as another pioneer later on.
Yeah, we should. Ollendorff. I was thinking about Ollendorff, and what was interesting is there was I can't remember which book it was. There's a book where a character uses the insult, "You Ollendorfian oaf."
Actually, I read about that in another book that I'm going to talk about on another episode.
And apparently that was a reference to Ollendorff's. The activities had a lot of repetition, just like a lot of activity books do now.
Yeah, I love repetition.
But somebody who's repeats themselves a lot, you can describe them as Ollendorfian.
Right.
Back in the late 18th century.
This podcast is quite Ollendorfian, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay. So sorry.
Yeah. Very derivative.
Sorry. What?
But he is, this Manesca chap is often credited as writing the first book, which really outlined what became, influenced the direct method and those kind of things. Okay. So he wrote this book. It's a huge book. It's over 500 pages, and it's mostly made of lesson plans.
Right.
But he also kind of explained his pedagogical philosophy.
Okay.
In the preface of the book, the beginning of the book. So here's a quote. Now, if there were a process through which the acquisition of a foreign language can be rendered easy, safe, and certain, it must be the process which nature follows in teaching us our mother tongue. For it cannot be doubted that she adopts the best means to attain her ends. So he was a naturist.
Right. Not a naturalist.
Not a naturalist.
Not what you're thinking of, man.
Indeed, what I am currently. Yeah.
So I guess he was one of the first people, and again with these pioneers who were a few centuries ago for us, but not that long ago in the history of the world.
Yeah.
But coming up with these ideas, learn your L2 the same way you learn your L1.
Well, this was I think so. Again, this book that I'm planning to talk about another time. For a long time, every language was learned in terms of rules, and it was considered just in terms of rules. And then there was this kind of explosion of interest in L1 learning, and then they thought L2 learning went along the same lines, and then we found out they were wrong.
Yeah, that was a little bit later.
Yeah,
that carried on for some time.
It did.
Yeah.
Very long time.
And talking of crazy English or those kind of weird methods, that seems a very easy little marketing tool that people come up with for these new methods.
Yeah.
They say, learn it just like you learned your first language.
Yeah.
But it's understandable why people would assume that's a way to do it. So he because of this idea of focusing on learning the way we learned our mother tongue, he refused methods which, number one, teach by abstract rules.
Okay.
Just like you mentioned. What do you think about that? Do you think it's a good thing to avoid any abstract rules when teaching a language?
No,
Or
actually.
learning a language?
I don't think so. I think that learning abstract rules is important, actually. I think that you need to be able to learn abstract rules because it helps you systematize what you're learning, but I don't think it should just be abstract rules. I think, you need some incidental learning as well.
But yeah, I mean, even today, there's still the debate of implicit and explicit knowledge and learning. And
the role of focus on form.
Yeah, and I think like a happy balance of the two is surely what the best way to proceed. I guess it's related.
Yeah. Okay. So the next kind of rule he had was he was against teaching by whole phrases readily made.
Okay.
So like language.
Formulate language.
Functions,
chunks, those kind of things.
Yeah.
He was against that.
He was against that.
See, I don't really have a problem with certain amounts of formulate language. I think chunks can be useful. I don't think we should go, I'm not a supporter of a total lexical approach. I don't think we should do that. But yeah, I mean, I think formulate language can be very useful. And often when learners make mistakes, it's because they don't know the particular formulate chunk they need to
Why was he against?
I assume that he thought it wasn't. Maybe he assumed that that's not how people learn their L1.
Right.
Although I think a lot of research says that
Yeah.
people do learn L1 through chunks now.
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest, I have to spend a bit of time with kids to realize they do that.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, and the other one that he refuted was methods which propose a series of words to be learned by rote as a provision for future use.
Yeah. So what? Don't learn vocab.
I guess like the way I read this is it's a series of words. So I imagine like a word list.
Okay.
Don't just memorize a word list and then hope in the future I'll use these words.
I have learned a lot of words through memorizing word lists.
Yep.
But I didn't learn the whole word list. Like I learned the word list, but only like 3 or 4 words really stuck.
Yeah.
But if I hadn't learned the word list, I wouldn't have learned any of the words.
Yeah.
So,
I think a lot of people say these days like the best way to learn vocabulary is to study lists, just study it, and like I can't remember who I was speaking to, but they were saying they don't see any problem with sitting down on the train and just looking at vocabulary.
Yeah. I mean, well,
Obviously, that's
Paul
not the
Nation
only-
said that that's
Right.
part of language learning, or part of vocabulary learning.
Yeah.
But it can't be
Part-
just the only
parts.
thing.
yeah, you have to then
Yeah.
use
Yeah,
it
yeah.
to do something. Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so he's not doing too well so far, Manesca. Okay, so
Calls himself a pioneer.
Did he have any like weird illness? Because a lot of our pioneers did, which we can.
I'll make one up by the time we get to the end.
Okay.
So his other kind of main point about language learning, I think he was a language teacher, but I think he expected his ideas to be applied to learning in general.
Right.
But he argued that nature relies basically on this idea of wants to engender learning.
Yeah.
So basically, what wants or needs? I don't know if there's much distinction there.
Yeah.
So I'll give you another quote. So man's wants are the spring which produces, modifies, and directs the current of his intellectual existence, insomuch that the expression of these wants is the first and the most constant and the last task to which all his faculties are bent.
Okay. So that's probably true, but that would then mean that there's no role for extrinsic motivations. That would be needs, right, rather than wants, I guess.
Right.
So your intrinsic stuff is your wants, and the extrinsic stuff is your needs, I guess.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think this was an idea that carried on for a long time, and maybe still holds some currency. But I guess it is the idea of motivation. But it seems like more recent research on motivation has shown that intrinsic motivation isn't enough.
Right.
Yeah.
You could really want to learn language, and that's not going to do it.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Well, I think we've all experienced that.
Okay. So he looked at how children learn languages, and the process that he kind of identified was what he called a substitution of elements of pantomimic language.
So copying.
Copying, basically. Yeah.
Glossolalia? Not glossolalia. That's when people just go blah, 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 right? It's got a word though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shadow. Right. But basically our children, they'll start by just copying what people around them say.
Yeah.
And then as they get older, it's not enough to really explain what they want to. And then they have to start playing around with the language.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is when they start, when kids start saying things like, I did dude, or whatever. You know, they have like, oh, I did seed, that kind of thing.
Right. So that's the step after the pantomimic, I guess.
Right, yeah.
Being creative, taking a risk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Language play, isn't it? I guess it's that whole later theory about language play.
Kind of, but I think for kids it's just them using it and not having quite fully figured out the rules yet.
Yeah, it's a form of play because they're testing the water and seeing what sticks, what works, what gets a reaction.
Right, but quite often I think they don't care what, like, so apparently like kids' mistakes are pretty much uncorrectable in a sense, like in terms of their language development. Like it doesn't matter if you say to them you're doing this wrong. You know, you should say this. They just keep saying it, and they'll correct themselves eventually.
Yeah. I mean, because there's a lot of, you know, the recasting is a very popular technique for parents with their children.
Yeah.
The child says, "I seed it."
Give it back. Yeah.
Right. But yeah, whether or not that has any effect.
Yeah.
Maybe not. Yeah.
It just makes the parents feel good about themselves.
Right.
So this is he's talking about kind of mimicry, isn't he? Just simply saying the sounds back, or
Yeah, I don't know if just the sounds or if they understand the meaning. Maybe it starts with just the sounds.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not sure how accurate his view of L1 acquisition is, but okay. So he did receive a lot of criticism on the course book, on this book he wrote, and he responded to this criticism.
Shut up, leave me alone.
He said, if the art of teaching were better understood and appreciated by the public at large, the objections would have no weight.
Right.
It's basically saying you don't understand.
Yeah. You don't understand me.
And another quote, this one's a bit longer. So he said, again, responding to the criticisms, he said, it is a great error to imagine that the elements of human knowledge should be presented to the mind in a restricted and concise view. On the contrary, they ought to be elucidated and disseminated over a wide surface, that no confusion should ensue, that the perceptive power should have full scope to distinguish everyone distinctly and become familiar with it.
Right, which sounds less like a defence and more like just a restatement of I think he's probably he's moving in the right direction. I think that's the interesting thing with studying TEFL pioneers in a sense, that you can see over time this growing understanding of how knowledge develops and how people develop, and you know the kind of the individual growth of individual people. So I think you can see that's in that statement. You can see how far along that path we'd come, and perhaps he was innovating in that area, even if he wasn't 100% there. And we're still not 100% there.
Exactly.
And we probably won't ever be 100% there.
Yeah. So he strongly criticized the books that were being used at the time. And then at just the end of this quote, he said, people who are surprised that a volume as large as this, remember it's over 500 pages long, as large as this is necessary to display the elements of a living language, have never reflected upon the nature, constitution, and amplitude of the human tongue. So in a way, I'm sure his 500-page book full of lesson plan stuff, as we've been discussing, doesn't always hit the mark. But I think maybe why he is identified as a pioneer in terms of language teaching is just kind of, like you say, broadening the field, trying to make people aware of the complexity of what we're trying to do when we teach a language.
Right.
Certainly seems like some of his ideas were quite groundbreaking at the time, and they had a lot of mileage in them, even up until like now, even or very recently.
Okay, and I'd like to finish with two quotes of Manesca's on the role of the teacher.
Okay.
So again, this is speaking to the teachers who are going to use this book.
Right.
He said, I beseech you never to forget for one instant that so far as teaching is concerned, this book is not written for your pupils, but that it is exclusively intended for yourselves, insomuch that during the few moments it is to be left in their hands, the first condition to which they must subscribe and most strictly adhere is that they shall make no use of it besides that which is pointed out for them.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not a course book for learners to follow, it's more for the teacher to use as a guide, I guess. Or...
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think this is a really interesting idea.
It's quite interesting.
Because I think most teachers then and now probably they have a book and they believe in the book. They can just use the book. They go in and, okay, do first page, do the next page.
Yeah.
And he's saying you can't do that. It's about you. It's about what you do with the book.
Dip in. Yeah.
That's the final quote. Just dip in.
Dip in, use that. Don't use it all, but use
Yeah.
Okay. I'll finish things with one final quote.
Okay.
About teaching from Manesca, and I think it's a nice quote, and we'll finish here. He said, "Teaching ought not to be a torment. A mental acquisition which is desired should not be purchased at the price of any mental or corporeal suffering. Teaching should be a pleasure, and when both the instructor and the pupil are willing and desirous of success, the method by which they are guided ought to ensure their success."
I think we can all agree with that.
A little bit optimistic, but a nice sentiment.
Yeah. Nice idealistic approach.
So that was this episode's TEFL pioneer, Jean Manesca.
Okay, so thank you very much for listening today.
If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can send an email to TEFLology@gmail.com. We always like hearing from our listeners. You can also follow us on Twitter @TEFLology or go and like our Facebook page. We also have a website, TEFLology-podcast.com, which has all of our episodes, as well as information about the podcast and about the three of us as presenters. So it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye.